Hello and welcome everyone to the Week of Visibility for Non-Monogamy. Tonight's event is part of a global week of action to promote visibility, challenge stereotypes, and celebrate love in all of its forms. This week, there are more than 40 events in 5 countries and languages designed to help normalize non-monogamy. My name is Aria. I use she, her pronouns. I'm joining you tonight from the San Francisco East Bay, also known as unceded Ohlone territory. And if you haven't already, we'd love to invite you to drop in the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from, and maybe a word or two about your experience or approach to non-monogamy, if that's something you're practicing, just to help us get a sense of who is in the room with us tonight. And in a moment, I'll introduce tonight's superstar lineup of writers and educators who we've gathered for this roundtable discussion. But I just want to set some intentions and share a little bit about why we're gathered here. There are still significant stigmas surrounding non-monogamy, and in many parts of the world, it's possible to lose housing or jobs or services if you're non-monogamous. And tonight's event was set up as a fundraiser for Open's advocacy work to advance the rights and acceptance for non-monogamous families and diverse relationship structures. And just a few weeks ago, Open helped pass non-discrimination ordinances in 2 California cities, Oakland and Berkeley, ensuring that all families, no matter their structure, are treated fairly and have equal access to essential services. So there's a lot more work to do, and we really just want to extend our gratitude to everyone who donated to support Open's ongoing advocacy work. And I'm really honored to be here with you all in the spirit of creating a world where non-monogamous families and diverse relationship structures are celebrated. The intention for our conversation is to explore the rich and diverse history of relationship structures across cultures and time periods, in search of more examples that will deepen our understanding of diverse ways of relating that center mutualism and community care and collaboration. And the hope is that by looking to the past, we can reclaim some of the rich traditions that might better serve us now and in the future, and help us imagine alternative ways of living and loving beyond the modern, colonial, patriarchal, monogamous, heterosexual norms that leave so many of us feeling disembodied and disconnected. So tonight we're going to be zooming through time and space to explore different cultures and traditions. But before we time travel, I'd love to invite us all into a brief moment of presence in the here and now with a very short embodiment practice. Given the stress of compounding global events that we're probably all holding, let's just slow down for a moment and take a moment to fully arrive here together and help us root into ourselves and be present with this beautiful, open-minded community advocating for a world with more love. So if it feels good, you can close your eyes for a moment or just soften your gaze and just take a moment to check in with your body. Maybe notice your feet on the floor or bring some awareness to your breath. And can you just begin to gently let go of wherever you just came from, whatever is still on your to-do list, and just fully arrive. Take a long, big, slow inhale through the nose. Let a big open mouth exhale. And as you continue to breathe, you can focus your energy on the parts of your body that are touching the ground or the chair, and just bring some awareness to whatever it is that's supporting your body in this moment. And you can even imagine some little roots from Mother Earth coming up and holding you. You take one more big deep breath in, big exhale, as you just imagine those roots connecting you to deepen and grow, rooting into your own values and resilience and cultural practices. So I want to invite us to use this 90 minutes to continue scanning the past in search of gems and wisdom that can more deeply support us as we all learn how to love and coexist. So thank you for taking that moment. And let's introduce our speakers. Our esteemed panelists don't need much of an introduction, but I'm just going to very briefly remind you of who is here with us so we can get into this discussion. I'm thrilled to be joined by Nick and Millie, the polyamorous educators at Decolonizing Love, whose pioneering work explores polyamory through the lenses of decolonization, desirability, politics, and inclusivity. Their work really aims to create accessible and supportive learning spaces that center marginalized communities. And I just want to take a special moment to congratulate Nick and Millie, who are celebrating 14 years together as of yesterday. It's so cool to see long-term examples of non-monogamous couples and have poly role models like you two. Next, we have Dr. Leanna Wolfe, who is an anthropologist, sexologist, and author of the book with the very juicy title, 177 Lovers and Counting: My Life as a Sex Researcher, which was a delightful read covering decades of her research and studies that have taken her far and wide, from Tibet to the Amazon, to polyamorous Burning Man camps, to a pilgrimage to rural East Africa in the 90s to better understand for herself how to live with a co-wife. Next, we have Evita Lavitaloca Sawyers, who is a coach, a speaker, an educator, and an author of A Polyamory Devotional, which offers 365 prompts that invite the consensually non-monogamous to do some deep personal reflections and ask big questions. And remember that we don't have to do this healing and self-growth work alone. Evita is also the subject of the groundbreaking 2016 polyamorous documentary, Polylove, and is known for thought-provoking commentary, which often questions the root of societal expectations. And last but definitely not least, we have Glenn Olson, who is the author of 50 Years of Polyamory in America, a guided tour of a growing movement, which offers a comprehensive look at the history of polyamory in the United States, spotlighting some of the key figures, the organizations, and the cultural shift that have shaped the movement over the last 5 decades. And I personally learned a lot from this book, and I'm really excited to dig into some of the fascinating stories here tonight. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let's get into it. So I'd love to start with a broad lens view of the historical and cultural context. And Evita, if it's okay, I'd love to start with you. Are there historical trends or shifts that have been most influential in shaping today's non-monogamous communities?
The current historical trend of decolonization. So I'm really glad that decolonizing love is here. We see that so rampantly, kind of said it's this thing, okay, decolonization, but what does that actually look like? And so it's causing us to have to go back to what the world was like before colonization even occurred. And there is not a lot of information about that, or a lot of like readily accessible information about that, because most of the story that, we've been told is the story of the colonizer. And so I think that in the decolonization work that we're doing as a society now, what it's causing us to do is bring all of these societal constructs that we have to the forefront and go, is this the way things are actually supposed to go? Or is this the way that we've been told that things are supposed to go, shaped by colonization? So to me, the historical trend that I see that is influencing current monogamy culture is like we're bringing forward the experience of having been colonized and having been colonized for such a long time, and now it's on the table and we're dissecting it, we're picking it apart, we're pulling it apart, and that is in it's on our relationship spaces as well, how we love, how we be in community with one another, how we pair, how we partner, how we parent, all of those things that non-monogamy touches. We tend to think of it as just how we do romance and how we do sex, but actually non-monogamy is how we do all of our relationships, for those of us that do live non-monogamously, and we know. And so it's bringing all of these concepts around, like I said, love, how to be in family, how to be in community, how to be in connection to another human being. We're bringing that forward, we're dissecting it, and we're trying to go back to a different time and a different experience. And so to me, this huge sort of umbrella term of decolonization work and what does that look like is causing us to have to kind of go back in history and go, okay, what things were we doing that got interrupted by colonization that we need to bring back in order to continue to survive actually as a species?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Nick and Millie, I'm wondering if either of you want to chime in about how colonial and Western norms have shaped our dominant views on monogamy, desirability, and relationship exclusivity.
That was amazing, Lavita. So there's not a lot of people don't even realize that we even have monogamy, we have heteronormativity. A lot of our ideas of desirability politics are shaped by the system. Things like the nuclear family, the lack of community, how we center romance, how we've normalized hierarchy as just a normal aspect of of our lives, whether it's a romantic life or just the way that our governance works, the way our community works, the way that we are in hierarchy towards nature with human beings above it, are all products of a colonial mindset. And we're seeing right now in late capitalism and also with global warming, the center is collapsing. We're seeing that these values, this system, these ways of thinking, these mentalities are not benefiting us on personal levels and not benefiting our world. And that we need to rethink and come back to, where did it all start? How did things go amiss? And that's where decolonization, helps. And we need to bring back indigenous voices who have been the ones who have been holding, ancient wisdom about how to take care of this world. I think 80% of biodiversity is protected by indigenous people. So they're here, they're still alive, and they're just waiting for us to come back and, to our roots and listen to some of the wisdom that they've been holding on to.
Beautiful. Thank you for that share. And Nick, I'm curious, what have you learned about the ways in which the Christian colonial mindset really shaped maybe your early ideas about what love is supposed to look like?
Yeah, I mean, I come from from Quebec, which was heavily influenced by the Christian church, and even my background being Italian and Greek, Christianity has definitely impacted these specific cultures. And so when I looked at how, especially in Quebec, how the Christian church impacted, it was pervasive in the educational system, how we privileged one man, one woman, and how kind of European patriarchy affected just the culture, ideas about possession, and just really how a man was supposed to act and how a woman was supposed to act. So once you know where it comes from, and so this is really where I'm coming from, and seeing now Quebec is still very much still in that culture, still very much influenced, and it takes years, it takes a generation to build awareness, to really see through all of these influences, to kind of start to unlearn them after a while.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. And yeah, I want to invite us just to take a step back further, before colonization. Leanna, you write in your new book that humans are by nature a non-monogamous species that readily becomes fascinated with new dopamine generating opportunities. And I'm wondering if you can just speak a little bit to the biological evidence for human non-monogamy.
Humans, as you were recalling from my book, are absolutely a non-monogamous species. And biological evidence of this comes from the differences in size between the male and the female, referred to as sexual dimorphism. And species where there's dramatic sexual dimorphism, like gorillas and orangutans, they are routinely non-monogamous. And humans also are sexually dimorphic enough that we too behave non-monogamously. Another thing has to do with the size of the testes. Now, chimpanzees have a relatively large testes and produce an excessive amount of sperm in terms of the need for impregnation. So basically what goes on is something that biologists have referred to as sperm wars. So a female is equipped to receive donations from more than one male donor in her cycle, and ultimately there's different types of sperm that engage each other either as blockers, fighters, or egg penetrators, and humans too behave this way. And so we're drawn to opportunities where there might be something called sperm competition. So these are a couple of the biological basis for this. Now, I just wanted to comment a little bit about human history. because actually some of the origins of monogamy have to do with the European colonizers. Now, earlier on in Europe, writers such as Montaigne claimed that anyone who thought that having sex with their spouse was interesting, he thought of them as droll and boring, and the more exciting thing is to have sex with lovers. And your spouse existed for other reasons than for pleasure. Now, when humans started colonizing America from Europe, what was going on is this was the first time in history for these folks to actually have the possibility of their own farm, their own livelihood, and for all males to be able to have a wife. Previously, it was just the oldest son in a family who would receive the family business and farm and be able to have a wife. So the monogamy became sort of this equalizer in early colonial America.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I want to pass it to Glenn. Both you and Leanna specifically referenced a rural New York experiment in cooperative living from the 1848s called the Oneida Community, which was a system that shared spouses in what they called complex marriage. I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about those cultural practices, their marriage customs, and why this experiment eventually dissolved.
Yeah, the Oneida community was and continues to be rather fascinating in a number of ways. The man who started it all was John Humphrey Noyes, and Noyes was first going to be a lawyer. He was interested in going into law, and then he was scooped up by the religious revival of the period and started studying Christianity at a depth that he hadn't before. And he decided that the way to be a perfect, proper Christian was a little different. His interpretation of the Bible was a little different than what was going on at the time. And his thought was that the perfect Christian way of living was to be in a community where every man was married to every woman was married to every man. He basically sold this idea to a bunch of people. They moved into the upstate New York area, settled several farms, built a community that took the name from the geographical area, Oneida. They were extremely successful for a number of reasons. One of which was they were good neighbors. They didn't piss off their neighbors very much or very often. They were industrious. They had fur trapping operations, operated farms. Eventually started a silver working company, which we still know of today, the Oneida Silver Company. And their idea was to organize everything and look at all the things they were going to do, act in agreement to make them happen. They lasted about 31 years, about 300 adults, a whole myriad of children. I could tell you why they eventually failed if you want, or we can go to it from Leanna.
Some of the reasons why the Oneidans failed is that they had developed a breeding program because they loved who they were and what they had created, and they wanted to obviously reproduce and pass on their wonderful ways. But what happened is the folks who they decided should be the fathers of this next generation were the old guard of the community, the older guys who they were more educated in religious and community values. And of course, mothers would be the young, fertile girls. And the young guys rebelled against this, that the older guys would be the fathers and that they would be not accepted into this. And word got out about what was going on and the world outside, and they summarily arrested them and forced them into monogamous marriages, which were, and I don't think they actually maintained the monogamy that was imposed on them. But ultimately, this effort in reproduction blew back in their faces.
And even though they were really organized in committees and groups and figured out ways of making decisions, one thing they failed to do was consider when change of leadership would take place, how to do it. At about year 31, John Humphrey Noyes withdrew, partly because of legal trouble, tried to pass on the community leadership to his son. People would not rally around him. They finally looked at each other and said, we're ending this experiment. But they were very wealthy at that time. And one of the things that they did was divide up all of the resources. People left the community in pretty good shape. A lot of people who had very strong relationships in the community then did form more nuclear families. And they went on. And of course, the ownership of the Oneida Silver Works maintained for 100 years after that. So.
Super fascinating. Well, thank you guys for that overview of that particular culture. I want to invite us to travel to Africa to touch on the culture of polygamy. Millie, I'm hoping you could share a little bit about your early experiences growing up in Kenya, what you learned there about traditional culture, and how that informed your perspective on relationships.
Yes. So I'm originally from Kenya, and I'm mixed race and mixed tribe. So I am from the Maasai, Kikuyu, and Dorobo tribes and the Kalenjin tribe. And I saw that somebody's actually from Kenya inside the chat. So they're in Nairobi, and I lived briefly in an area outside of Nairobi called Kiserian. Kiserian is on Maasai territory, and I grew up most of my life in urban dwellings, and most of my family are monogamous. I've assimilated into more Western Christian types of monogamy, but I do have 2 aunts who have married themselves. But during this time, this was my first time living in traditional Maasai territory, and I grew up hearing from my assimilated Christian families about the benefits of monogamous marriage versus polygamy, and the polygamy was something that we have left behind, that we're in a better place right now. And I heard all these, things about how horrible polygamy was. But living in Maasai territory, I actually got to see the truth. And I would see that my Maasai neighbors had much more stable marriages and relationships than Kenyans who had assimilated into Christianity and urban Kenyans. There was non-monogamy divorces. There seemed to be a lot more harmony. There was much more family solidarity. But one of the things that struck me the most was the honesty of the polygamous families, and also the lack of orphans. Nairobi has the biggest slum in Africa, but it also has a very large street children population. I remember when I was a child, I think it was 100,000 children were street orphans in Kenya. And in Maasai territory, there were no orphans. So it was just such a very stark contrast going in from a place where you see street children as young as 3 on the streets and going into Maasai territory. And because of polygamy, there was this traditional safety net. If a child, parent or mother died, there was always a co-parent. There was always somebody to take in those child. But with colonization is that these safety nets that we had in our community were destroyed. But going back to the honesty, which is one of the things that I really admired about my Maasai tribe, there's the myth that we're all taught is just how it's so sexist towards women. But what I find interesting about Western culture is Western culture treats men as the prize, whilst in traditional Maasai territory, it's those who give life are the prize. And with that, and the reason why there's polygamy is that not everybody deserves that prize. Not everybody can take care of that prize. And, some people are just better off as boyfriends. And so women would get married to a man who was able to take care of a family. You had to be a warrior to be able to get married in the first place, which means kill a lion with your bare hands back in the day. But it's changed a little bit. But, women were allowed to have, boyfriends and they could even get pregnant with those men, but that child would just belong to the man who can actually take care of that child. So I saw a lot more balance and honesty, and nobody pretended monogamy, versus when I would look at those who had assimilated to monogamous culture, is that there was a lot of cheating, there was a lot of divorces and the orphans. And I just, there was a lot of lying to oneself. And that was what influenced me as a child to become non-monogamous.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, I've heard you speak a little bit about your mother's matriarchal tribe and the idea of self-marriage. I'm curious if you can just talk a little more about that tradition and the ways or differences that maybe self-marriage is similar or different to solo polyamory. Yeah, curious how that kind of looks at prioritizing self first and foremost.
I think there's some intersections with solo polyamory, but it's also very different. I mean, polyamory is something that was coined in 1988 versus our self-marriage is very much based on certain cultural aspects. So in Kikuyu culture, it's men who take care of the land. There, a lot of East African cultures are warrior cultures. So it's men defend the land. So to be able to inherit land, it's usually men who inherit the land because they're the defenders, and your husband would inherit the land for you. But let's say you don't want to get married. You never want to get married. Then what? Are you not able to inherit your parents' land? So the workaround of this is self-marriage for women. So women can marry themselves, and you're only allowed to traditionally through a traditional called Kamweredo once you've hit menopause. I hear a lot of young women are nowadays getting self-married, which I don't understand how that was allowed. But anyways, traditionally, you have to prove to the tribe that you can take care of yourself, that you love yourself. So both my aunts got married in their 50s. There are people who had businesses that had children. They had shown to the tribe that their ability to be autonomous, independent, and take care of themselves, in a way that was honorable and love themselves. And so they had bridesmaid, they had a groom, they did a whole vows, etc. of self-love before marrying themselves. So it's not the same as solo polyamorous because you don't necessarily have to. Solo polyamorous is, somebody who's self-partnered but has multiple partners. Because you could be a person who actually is happy being celibate and be self-married. You could be a person who maybe is monogamous, monocentric, and be self-married. You're just a person who just never wants to have a man nest with a man, cohabit with a man.
So fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. Let's go to Evita. I'd love to hear a little bit about, in your experience, how different cultural backgrounds influence people's attitudes and practices around non-monogamy. And yeah, curious if you can share any examples of how cultural perspectives on relationships have even impacted your coaching clients' journey.
I noticed that some cultures can be a little bit more entrenched in patriarchy than others. And so I think I've noticed that a lot more. And so in my coaching clients where that tends to be the case, especially in the case of maybe having a heterosexual couple, there's a lot more work that kind of needs to be done with male of the couple or the man of the couple and unpacking those kinds of things. I definitely don't tend to work with clients for whom they wish to have a one penis policy. So I am one of those kinds of people. I'm like, grown folks are going to do what they do, but I don't necessarily have to help them do those things. And so I tend to have clients that are wanting to not impose some of those patriarchal ideals onto their wives. And so part of one of the beauties of non-monogamy is getting a opportunity to really work through that in a practicum kind of way, as opposed to just this in theory type space. So I definitely have noticed that. I also noticed that in the Black community specifically, there is a lot of focus on things like nation building, developing a tribe. It's in our decolonization practices, we are sort of looking at the, societies that existed, before the transatlantic slave trade and before we were brought over here, and trying to see how we can replicate those things in our modern communities. And one of the things that, has been introduced is this idea that's similar to kind of what Millie was talking about, is one man having multiple wives and sort of having this nation building type thing. While I also don't necessarily judge that as in people can do what they want, and I do believe that there's merit to all forms of how this exists, but a lot of the reasoning behind that is steeped in patriarchy. It's sort of this covert sort of colonialism that's still actually there. And so I definitely notice things like that with my clients. And then also, too, there are definitely cultures and communities where it's a lot easier to find community as it relates to non-monogamy than it is for others. And so that's definitely something that I noticed. So I don't tend to see a lot of like Asian polyamorous communities or even Latina polyamorous communities. I often have clients that come to me and they may be some form of Hispanic, and they're like, where is our group of people? And I'm like, honestly, I really don't know. And so I do think that there are some cultures that they do have a lot more conservative ideals. Not that they're not necessarily doing these things, but they're not doing these things in a public way so that they can easily find a community amongst that portion of their identity. So that is definitely something that I do notice as well. As it relates to people's cultural intersections and like how they operate in non-monogamy. And then obviously, I think marginalized cultures are a lot more heavily scrutinized for living in ways that are seen as alternative. And so that also impacts how public facing a lot of cultures feel that they can be as it relates to being non-monogamous, because it's like you already have a target on your back by way of your marginalization, and now you're going to add an additional one, and being quote unquote deviant and how you conduct your relationship. So that's definitely something that I see with my clients as well, is how much shame they internalize about doing it, and also just how open they feel about expressing publicly that's how they live.
Thank you. And Evita, I got a private question from someone asking, what is a one penis policy? Would you be so kind as to explain that for us?
Absolutely. So a one penis policy, for those that don't know, we generally see this in couples that are comprised of a heterosexual cisgender man and a cisgender woman. She does not have to be heterosexual, and actually usually they're not. So usually it's a cisgender bisexual woman. The one penis policy will stipulate that the woman is allowed to have all of the partners that she wishes to have that do not possess a penis, but she is restricted from being able to have partners that possess or in possession of a penis. And so it's called a one penis policy, meaning that you will be the only, or that person who has a penis will be the only penis that person interacts with. We see that very heavily with heterosexual couples that enter into non-monogamy because patriarchy. And also, it is a way that invalidates relationships between non-men as not real or not as threatening. I definitely do not subscribe to the notion of having a one penis policy. I would never subject myself to one. But there are actually bisexual women that say that they're really not interested in other men. They really just want women. That is valid. But I also often tell those couples, I'm like, well, if that's really true, then there does not have to be a policy, because you don't really want to do that anyway. So it is a way of patriarchal control that a lot of men entering into non-monogamy will wield over their bisexual women partners, and sometimes even their straight women partners. I've seen that before also. So so that is what the definition of a one penis policy is.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and just because you touched on shame, I want to bring in an audience question that we got during registration. We can open this up to anyone. Someone asked, how do monogamous social norms continue to shame consensually non-monogamous folks and keep them in the closet? I'm curious if anybody wants to speak to that.
Basically, we still live in, at least in the Western world, in a place where monogamy is the norm and the expectation, and anyone who has some kind of public standing in terms of, especially in politics or some other kind of professional world, probably not so much in arts and music and such, is expected to be moral by being monogamous. And so even if they're really not, they're expected to hide it. And if it's exposed, then it is seen as something threatening, like witness what happened with Bill Clinton back in the late 90s. He was basically told that, it's, you're not behaving the way in a presidential way. And, certainly things have shifted in the meantime, but nonetheless, there's a lot of expectation that monogamy is somehow a sign of morality.
Yeah, definitely. Anybody else want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I'd like to add a few things. So, we really get to see it as like polyamory educator is with a social media account, because I mean, we do see in the comments sometimes, it's not always positive comments, there's some negative comments. And I mean, it's like we do see, people trying to police or trying to ensure we stay in the closet through shame. And we had actually a post about shame about a few weeks ago, and there's different ways that people will shame. I'm going to use actually Loca's word being deviant, right? So like deviancy in a mononormativity world or compulsory monogamy world can be like being very sexual, hypersexual. And so if you're non-monogamous, you're seen as hypersexual and you can't control your impulses. So there's other things too. I mean, religion plays a role, which like religion is no stranger to shaming people into being proper, moral, as Leanna pointed out. There's also the aspect of kids. When kids are involved, we get that a lot. We get a lot of negative comments. It's like, oh, if you have kids, no, you can't teach that to your kids. Like it's only, you're teaching them immoral things. You're not raising children properly. And so what it does, it shames a lot of parents as well into not coming out. And there's this undertone especially in certain countries, and I know the threat is especially heightened in the United States, about the threat of having your kids taken away from you. There are no protections. In Canada, I believe there are not really protections, neither in the United States, and so you can legally have your children taken away from you. I'm not sure if I ever heard a case, but there have been close calls with a lot of people where custody has been taken. There's been child and protection services that have showed up to do like these check-ins. And so all these aspects can definitely keep somebody in the closet for sure.
Definitely. Yeah. I think that's, a reason why it's so important that we have spaces like this tonight to gather and create community and a sense of belonging for people who maybe don't have places to have these conversations. Glenn, I'd love to hear from you. In your book, it starts with a foreword that explains how the term polyamory was coined in the 90s. And it was for an article in a pagan magazine, which I think is fascinating. If you want to talk at all about the intersection between paganism and polyamory, and maybe tell us a little bit more about what was happening in American culture in the 90s that required a new word for this multi-lover expanded relationship option.
Absolutely. Happy to do that. Actually, if I may, I will start just a little earlier than the 90s. Modern day polyamory is the wonderful child of about three very powerful social forces going on in the 1950s and 1960s. They were the civil rights movement. Powerful. The civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s taught us that it was okay to be an activist, to stand up for things that are right, to have rights go to a lot of people. Very strong. At the same time, the human potential movement in the 1960s was a psychological and self-help movement that was coming up with technologies teaching people that it was fine to look at yourself as powerful, and that wherever you are right now, you can make choices and you can change who you are and what you're doing next time. What you're doing, tomorrow. At the same time, the 1950s had something called the beat culture, which was an intellectual culture which included go on a spiritual quest, question government, question your beliefs, and that turned into the energetic hippie movement of the 1960s, which threw in the paradigm of free love, sex, drugs, rock and roll. And those were just blasting through American society until the late 1960s, when people like Oberon Zell, who was a hippie, who was a scholar of Greek and Roman mythology, happened to read a science fiction novel by a man named Robert Heinlein called Stranger in a Strange Land. And the people in this book were giving up having jealousies. They thought that having more lovers, having more love in your life was a good thing. They had a bunch of ideas about how to make that happen. He went and he turned that into a template for his life. And at the same time, since he was a scholar of mythologies, he understood what the earlier pagan religions were. So he started the pagan and neo-pagan movements in the United States. Got very, very well known. And even though it was, call it a fringe religion, it gained adherents through the 1970s and 1980s. And not everyone who was pagan was also an open relationship type of person, but many of them were. At the same time, other people in the United States, many thousands, maybe up to hundreds of thousands of people by the 90s, were experimenting with having a more open type of relationship to the idea that you can be non-monogamous. Oh, I can be ethically non-monogamous. Oberon's wife, Morning Glory Zell, kept being upset that his friends, their friends, all hundreds of friends, they just kept messing up their relationships. They would make mistakes. We were making it up as we went along. The technologies didn't exist until we figured out, well, how will we do this? How will we do that? She's sat down and complained long enough that Oberon and their sister wife said, okay, write an article telling people how to do it right. And so she did, and that article was called A Bouquet of Lovers. And for that article, she and Oberon sat down and figured out, we have so many clunky words. You're in an open marriage, but maybe you're not married. You're in an open relationship. Well, am I in a relationship right now, or am I just, do I just have a lot of lovers and I'm not really relating to them any other way? So they came up with the word polyamory, and they used a form of it in the article, and it went viral from there because it was a compact term that covered a whole bunch of activities that we were figuring out how to do, and it just resonated. What was the rest of your question? I'm sorry.
I think you answered most of it. That's really helpful. Thank you so much for giving us that rich history. And I see somebody commenting in the chat, I attended many pagan gatherings with Oberon Zell back in the 90s. That article was a big deal. Yeah, Leanna, go ahead.
Oh, I would add another factor to all the factors that Glenn added, which was the baby boom, which caused a swell of folks to be born in the mid-50s and not as many folks to be born before then. And the tradition here, at least in the Western world, was for women to partner with men that were a bit older than them. And since not enough men were born for these mid-50s women, many of them carried on and ultimately had very independent and sexually free lives. And that certainly spirited the sexual revolution and feminism in terms of women not needing to be in a monogamous partnership with a guy.
Yeah, thanks for that addition. Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating that, the word polyamory was published in a magazine. There was a lot of inspiration from this writer. And as a panel of writers and educators who are all working to destigmatize and normalize non-monogamy, I'd love us just to talk a little bit about the importance of storytelling to increase visibility for all these different ways of relating. And Evita, you were the subject of this 2016 documentary, Polylove. I'm curious if you can share a little bit about that experience and how you think sharing personal stories through media can really help shift cultural perceptions of non-monogamy.
So how that even came about, this is a very interesting story, is I was a part of the Black and Poly online Facebook group, and someone came in the group and said, hey, they're looking for non-monogamous relationships that are willing to be filmed. This person is doing their film school thesis on non-monogamy, and is anybody in the California area that's willing to do this. And so I volunteered. I was like, yeah, I'd be willing to do this. And there was actually supposed to be another relationship that was supposed to be featured in the documentary as well, and something happened where they backed out. And so at the time, I was married to my then husband, and we were in a triad relationship. So we had a partner that we were with. There was three of us, and we lived together. She was like another parent for our children. Everybody in our lives knew that was a relationship we had with this person. And so they shifted the documentary to just being about our triad. And I'm going to say 2 days before the filming, we broke up. 2 days before the film.
Perfect.
But we still shot it and we still talked about the relationship. So we still filmed it, and it was like maybe over a 2-week period. And then we decided to get back together at the end. And at the time, when we started filming, we didn't know that was where it was going to go. And so it's a very interesting documentary, because it's not like they're just doing, a day in the life of this polyamorous family, but it tells a very real depiction of like what these relationships are like. They're not easy. They're not for the faint of heart, and also real things happen. And I think why the storytelling is so important is, number one, it helps to at once go, oh, they're just like us. And so people are able to humanize non-monogamous people, in that they struggle with schedules and forgetting someone's anniversary and all of these same things that we see happen in monogamy. It's just, with more people that you're doing those things with. I think it also like shows the ways in which it is different, but it does so in such a way that maybe allows it to be a little less threatening, because it adds the other piece of having that humanizing aspect of going like, oh, they're just like us. And even though they're not just like us in these ways, they're just like us in these other ways. And it makes the ways that we're not like them seem not as threatening, because they're able to humanize us, because there is so much myth about what being in a non-monogamous relationship is like. There's just so many just ideas that sometimes I hear them, I'm just like, seriously? But it's because people don't know non-monogamous people. There's no representation of it. They don't know that their neighbor may possibly be non-monogamous, or the person on their job. They don't really know that. And so they're able to sort of come up with all these wild ideas of what it's like. And because I really liked what Leanna said about how moral people assume that monogamy is, most of the time, these things that people are coming up with about what being non-monogamous is like are usually tinged with this sort of moral judgment. Where there's just these deviant people, we're greedy, we're like all of these things that are not reflective of like what we actually are. We're just humans who want to be in relationship with others in different ways. And so I think it is important that we are telling our stories. So number one, like I said, we're seeking to humanize who we are. I think also for me, what was so important about it is so much of the public face of polyamory was very white when I came into the community. And so there was a lot of just, white people. This is, we have this term, that's white people shit, and that was a lot of what it was seen as, this is some white people shit. And so it was very important, and that has been very important for me throughout the course of my non-monogamous journey, to be very open about my non-monogamous life, because I'm like, it's not white people shit. It really isn't. Black people are doing this. All kinds of people are doing this. And so that was what was very important for me. But storytelling is important, both from humanizing us, and then also as a beacon. Because literally, I have a very good friend of mine now who is a non-monogamous coach, who is a polyamory educator, who I've worked with in the past. And she literally told me, I saw your documentary, and she was in a triad at the time, and she was raising her son with her 3-person family. And she was like, oh my goodness, here is somebody else that's doing this thing that I'm doing. And so it helped her to feel a lot less isolated, and helped her to feel a lot more like, I can actually be open about this thing that I'm doing. There are actually other people out there that look like me that are doing this too. I'm not so weird. And so, storytelling is important, not just for the people outside of our community to humanize ourselves, and then also for the people within our community, so that we can find our folks and we all can feel less isolated and less alone.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Thank you for that. Yeah, Millie, I'd love to hear how you think about storytelling, and what are the types of stories that you're interested in seeing more of, and kind of how you think about content creation and creating resources to help shift the dialogue.
Absolutely. I'm a professional writer, and I'm an influencer actually as a way to promote more writing in my literature. Narrative is important because it doesn't just only reflect reality, it constructs it. And we've been taught so much about the story of monogamy, this narration of monogamy as the only norm, as the only valid way of being. And it's interesting talking about, what was her name again? The Bouquet of Flowers was written by Oberon Zell. And, there were libertarians, very white, And with this idea of this is when the West woke up to this new thing, this non-monogamy, this polyamory, whilst, it's interesting how colonizers write the narrative. Non-monogamy is being practiced by BIPOC cultures for millennia and shamed and put down. And it's always interesting being a polyamory influencer. People are looking for advice when I'm like, there's all these cultures around the world that have great best practices that you ignore, that you continue to shame, and all this that you could be learning from. And part of what I try to do is try to bring some of that indigenous knowledge, that those indigenous storytelling and some of those resources, people like Dr. Kim Tallbear, who runs the blog, The Critical Polyamorous, which gives some advice about how Indigenous people here on Turtle Island have been forming families and best practices, because those stories are right here. That wisdom is right here if you seek to, if you want to find it. So our best content, the ones that get the most views are our skits, the ones that model polyamory. And a lot of people are looking for more representation, and it's quite dire in the media. There's a lot of great theory, there's a lot of great books, but we don't have enough models of how to do polyamory. So we don't want to give away what we've been working on, but hopefully we'll be able to show you all soon, because we are the stories that we tell ourselves of who we are. And so for that it's very important to talk about non-monogamy, and so other people can be seen and know that they're not alone.
To a lot of people, that's the best way to learn. It's just through storytelling. Like we've learned that way for since the beginning of the time. Like storytelling was the way we learn things, and so and our brains still learn that way a lot of times.
I want to say one last thing. I don't think it's any like when you look at all the great religions, how they always say it starts with the word. It's the first word in the Bible. It starts with the word, because the word is what shapes us all. It's the Big Bang. It's a sound. It's a thing that brings into life who we are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off that too, and just say that loss of the importance of storytelling is a colonization carryover. And this hard, adherence to data and fact and quantifiable information, and it wasn't a, hey, storytelling is important and also this is important, and how are we merging to those two things? It was like, no, this is important and this is not important anymore. And so we don't really hold the importance of experience and people talking about their experiences, which is what story is. And storytelling is absolutely a tool where we learn, where we grow, where we are able to present ideas in ways that are palatable for human beings. We have the fable, we have, these oral traditions in our indigenous communities that were passed down. That is how history got carried. That is how the social mores got carried. That is how we taught people how to be in community with each other, was through story. And we lost a lot of that when colonization came in, because we shifted until the mind identified. We're mind identified. And story, it really rests in the space of feeling. It rests in the space of emotion, and that's part of colonization. So stories are extremely important to carry information and to shape our societies, because narrative, like she said, is how we develop ourselves, how we think about ourselves, how we think about our world, is through the stories that we tell ourselves, to the words that we hear. So yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you all. Yeah, I mean, Millie, to go back to what you shared about your skits and, showing examples of dialogues are wonderful. And yeah, the link just got put in the chat for that. And in regards to Kim Tallbear, she actually was an invited speaker tonight. She's working on a book. So speaking of more, media creation, so that's why she wasn't able to join us here tonight. But I would love us to just do one more little time travel before we move to audience questions. We talked about polygamy in Africa, but Leanna, I'd love to invite you to share a little bit of your learnings about polyandry, whether you want to focus on Tibetan culture or Amazon culture.
Well, I first wanted to comment just a little bit on storytelling, if that's possible.
Sure,
I created a project for my students during my long career as a professor, which was a sex history story where people could shared their sex histories, whatever they were. And it became this safe place for my students to explore, and reveal and tell story to themselves and ultimately share with me, how things had been going and what their emergences were like and what their dreams were. And in reflecting on that project, I realized that I had a sex history too, and that my history was very much the history of being a sex researcher. And that's what led to my book, and ultimately, in putting my book out, I decided to create a solo show. And so I've been performing that show, which certainly includes stuff on my journeys in polyamory. And so that show's been playing at the Hollywood Fringe Festival, at Solo Fest, and most recently at the Collage Theater in San Pedro here in Los Angeles. And okay, so then on to polyandrous cultures. That's what we're gonna chat about a little bit.
Yeah, I would love, if you can explain for people. I mean, I understand it is generally shorthand for one wife, multiple husbands. And
right.
it's practiced by just 0.5% of the world,
yeah,
right?
Right. It's a very, amongst non-Western cultures, it's very rare. Amongst polyamorous cultures, there's many females who have multiple partners, and largely the basis of it is economic, and it was typically, at least amongst the Nyimba of Tibet, it was a practice in which brothers would share a wife, and there was a whole economic logic to it, where oftentimes these people their family owned a hillside farm, and if they were to subdivide it, it would not be profitable. And so the way to keep the farm profitable, and having one brother, let's say, manage the yaks, another manage trading, another manage crops, they needed to have multiple males doing this, and brothers grew up this way and knew how to cooperate this way, and the efficient thing to do would be to marry a single wife so that the farm wouldn't be subdivided, with each brother taking a portion of it and not having that work out too well. Of course, the question then became well, what happens to all the females that aren't married, because there's a bunch of brothers sharing one woman, and largely there's a bunch of informal relationships that go on. Sometimes the youngest brother in a family would split off because he didn't feel drawn to the wife that his older brothers married, and he would leave and have his own wife. And sometimes women would have children but not be legally married to a particular husband.
Got it. And it's my understanding that this Tibetan cultural practice is now outlawed by the Chinese government. Can you speak at all to either that, and also thinking about the fact that polygamy is also outlawed in the United States after the Edmunds Anti-Polygamy Act of 1882? I'm curious if Leanna or you or others want to speak about that.
Basically, it's all about economics and threatening in terms of units different from a monogamous coupling having power and having ownership and living cultural ways that are seen as aberrant and immoral. And even in the Western world, we're still completely overwhelmed by things for couples. Like, you can rent a hotel room for two people for the same price as you can rent it for one. Lots of tour packages have rates that basically presume you're traveling as a couple rather than traveling as a triad or whatever other form you're traveling in. So there's just this kind of couple normalization, which is, really defeating to other ways that folks may be drawn to living and may really enjoy living.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to read a couple sentences that Millie and Nick posted on their Instagram account last month that I loved and want to just bring in. They write, polyamory challenges the monogamous norm that was enforced and globalized by European colonization, which portrayed love as scarce. Love is abundant. We resist the limiting beliefs imposed by colonization. Love should not be confined to just a nuclear family. That's a narrow way to love. And Nick, I'm curious, as we think about this idea of broadening the cultural definition of love to be more inclusive, what are a couple tangible practices that people might do or incorporate to start moving towards a more embodied idea that love is an abundant resource, and or start dismantling some hierarchy or couples privilege in their own relationships?
Great question. So first of all, I think it's important to distinguish between hierarchy and couple privilege. A lot of people tend to conflate the two, and Dr. Wolfe kind of alluded to that with that couple normalization. That, like, I think that's a really good way to describe like couple privilege. And there were a few examples that were said. There's this idea that the couple is that it should only be a couple, and we associate certain privileges to if you're in a couple, and we don't give those type of privileges to if you're three or if you're more. There's no his and her, or her and his like towels. There's this his and hers, like they come together. And so I think the first step to moving towards a love that is more inclusive, more abundant, is to recognize these things. We do have a video on how to dismantle couple privilege. So it's one of those things, is just educating yourself as much as possible, educating your surroundings, your family, your friends. We've done that a lot, where we had to tell our friends that all because you invite us, don't expect us to bring the other person. We might bring somebody else, and don't expect that it'll be a +1. It might be a +2, or we might choose to come alone to any invitation. So it's getting everybody educated on that part. I think it's important to also, it's like we talk about hierarchy as well, and I'm just going to briefly go into hierarchy a little bit and how that's different from couple privilege. So hierarchy is more of an active thing. It's where you are actively trying to disempower somebody. It's this ranked system where you're actively trying to disempower somebody that is ranked below you. So this can come in many forms. So this can come in the form of influencing another relationship that is not yours. That can come, and it's the most common thing that people think about is veto power, where you would veto your partner's partner. Another way to influence another relationship is just by like talking badly about them, or using your status as either the longer relationship or the one that's more connected to their family to disempower another relationship. So I mean, it's not only veto power, but that's what we commonly use. And so and we usually associate hierarchy as a little bit of a monogamous hang-up, in the sense that there is this undertone of it's a crutch for your own emotional security. It's very challenging for a lot of people to be able to freely love and not influence your partner or your partner's partner, their relationship. Let that relationship be and live organically, and just be happy for your partner, or let them live that journey of love with multiple people. And so we usually say education, a lot of introspection, a lot of check-ins, and these are just like, that's the first step. And recognizing also the codependence. We talk about codependence a lot in and how that affects couple privilege, how that affects hierarchy as well. And so again, it's just learning about all this, being aware, recognizing it, and that's...
Yeah, I just want to chime in very quickly, because I don't want to take too much. One of the things that we realized is one of the reasons why people cling on to hierarchy, and why the couple is so important in Western culture, is because of the destruction of community. When you have no other security other than your partner, your nuclear family, it ends up being this vessel for like all the security that and so it's very important for people who also one of the reasons why people are so stuck on it is that they actually need to go back to community. They need to form community. And I think that's a missing part for a lot of people in their education of how to do that. Western culture centers romance so much. The movies, the storytelling, it must have a romantic element, but rarely has necessarily a community element. So this education piece, part of the tools of dismantling hierarchy, of dismantling couple privilege, is also coming back to community and learning how to be in community. So
yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah. I just want to pass it to Glenn quickly. Thinking about the idea of community, your book explored lots of different communities, Caristas in San Francisco. I'm curious if there's any other communities that are worth bringing in, just, their ideas about relationship structures and more acceptance of diverse family models.
I think Millie talked really passionately and strongly about her Maasai experience, where, community is family, and families are basically what we need to be the building blocks of community. There are some communities in the recent past that I can talk about, but actually, what I'd like to do, if I may, is I would like to read you the definition of family as the UN thinks about it. So there are 193 nations of the UN, and they can't agree on anything, basically. And one of the things they cannot agree on is what is the definition of family. But the UN work group has published this proposal and trying to get the nations to see if this is what we will all accept. The family is a unit of two or more persons united by marriage, blood, adoption, or consensual union, in general constituting a single household, interacting and communicating with each other, and sharing a common kitchen, plus financial resources on a regular basis. And the reason for these are basically boiled down to two things. One, protection of children, and two, conservation of wealth. Those are the two driving forces that family gives us as human beings, whatever our family looks like. So I just wanted to share that. One of the organizations that started here in the United States in the 1960s and 70s was called Family Synergy. And that was what they were trying to look for. They were trying to build families. They had thought that the best way to build a family is first you start as a couple, the basic economic unit, and then go out and court and marry other couples and build your family in groups of two people. There are a lot of reasons why there are a lot of major sociological and psychological stresses for groups of people that are equal numbers. For some reason, odd numbers like triads and people of five and things like that are a lot more stable. And I will defer to the psychologists and sociologists for why that is. But that was the goal. And through the 1970s and 1980s, the idea that building family on already established units of two people was something that just seemed right. And then Family Synergy started noticing people showing up at their events that were in groups of three, that were in triads, either three individuals that had met each other, three people that had started off as a couple and another one joined them, three people who had started off as two couples and one person looked at the situation and said, no, not for me, and left. And the idea of a triad has gotten a lot of strength in our country, in our societies. Several of the longest lasting relationships that I know of are triads. One is 25 years and going.
Oh, impressive. Yeah, I love all of this conversation about what it means to be a family, what it means to be in community. And I'm seeing a lot of questions come in from the chat. How do you build community? What does it look like to be in community with people you don't like? And I'd love to kind of just open this up. Evita, I'm curious if you have thoughts on your advice for building community.
Well, firstly, I think that number one, what people struggle with in finding community is we don't live lives of authenticity. Often people are not finding community because they're not really looking in the right places, because they're not really revealing their true selves. And to me, one of the hallmarks of being in real authentic community is being honest about who we are so that we can actually find your folks, is what I say. You can find your aligned tribe. And so I think, the first things that kind of need to happen is we need to remove all of these systems that cause us to have to mask in these ways that actually cause more isolation than it does cause connection. So that to me is one of the first things that come forward is you have to be willing to be honest. You have to be willing to be seen and to be in community, and to be in community in ways that are authentic and sustainable. Because it's hard to be in community with people that you don't feel seen by, you don't feel like you can be your whole vulnerable self with. And why that is important is because community, one of the things, the hallmarks of community is we're not just there when things are going well, we're there when things are going poorly, and we have to be willing to be seen in the most vulnerable aspects of ourselves in order to be in strengthened communities. So I think that is important. I think also learning how to communicate well, learning how to communicate expectations, what you expect. What does it mean to be someone's partner? What does it mean to be a neighbor? What does it mean to be a friend? Make sure that you're able to recognize what those values are for yourself and that you can communicate those effectively to the people that are around you. So once again, you find your tribe, I think is incredibly important as it relates to building community. And then also what does it mean to be in community with people that you don't like, which does occur. I've definitely had metaphors that I weren't that fond of, family members that, I'm not particularly jazzed to be around. But I think that there's a difference between disliking someone and also being able to recognize that they are a whole human being, that they are worthy of a human experience, and learning how to separate. I may not like this person, but I can still recognize that they are a human being. They're worthy of respect, dignity, all of these things that I want from my life. They're at least worthy of it. Now, I don't have to facilitate those things, but I could definitely hold that they are worthy of those things. And then also boundaries. I think one of the biggest things that we need to learn in order to form strong communities is how to be boundaried as communities, and also how to be boundaried as individuals. Because I guarantee if we don't know how to be boundaried as a community, we don't know how to be boundaried as an individual. And if we don't know how to be boundaried as an individual, we will not know how to be boundaried as communities. So even being in community with someone that you don't like can be possible if you are a well-boundaried person and you know where your boundaries are. It's saying, hey, I don't really want to interact with this person a ton. Can you please keep them over there? But they deserve to live just over there. So, so to me, one of the hallmarks of like I said, building strong community is authenticity, empathy, strengthening our empathy practice, strengthening our communication practice, and then also a willingness to move through conflict in ways that are generative is one of the hallmarks of finding communities. How are we moving through conflict in one another that allows us to remain in connection with one another? Because if we're going to be on this long stretch of life with one another, conflict is going to occur. How are we learning how to have those things in a way that is generative? And most of what we see around conflict is punitive, it's carceral, it's not generative. And so shifting away from these ways that we are in connection with each other to how do we have more models that are empathetic, kind, vulnerable, authentic, compassionate, generative, is important.
Yeah, so important. So well said. So I just want to do a time check. We've got about 8 minutes left. And as we begin to close, I want to invite you all for a moment to put on your biggest optimistic dreamer hats for a moment. And as you think about your ideal future world, what does the culture look like surrounding relationships? How are we relating to each other now and in the future? And how does the work you're doing now fit into that? Maybe we can do Leanna, Millie, Glenn, Nick, and then Evita. We'll hear from you again at the end. How's that sound?
Okay, good. All right. So I just imagine a world of many possibilities where children are not socialized to presume that they're going to have a white wedding and that they'll be married till death do us part, but they grow up in a context where they see that love and relationship and connection and community are fluid, as identities are fluid, and that we can travel through the river of life in such a way that different times, different moments, different people become important, and then maybe they'll fade, but then other things emerge, and that we're not like bound by the rules and expectations of couples or monogamy or, any particular kind of family.
Well said. Thank you. Millie, how about you?
When I imagine a future, I think of one with relational diversity, one that where we decenter romance and we center more community, and that we value all the different relationships that make us who we are as human beings. That includes our family, that includes our neighbors, that includes our colleagues, that we see each other, as Lavitaloca was saying earlier, and that we hold space for all, the human beings that nurture our lives. I see a world where we are also honoring more Indigenous wisdom and looking at our relationship to the earth, and one where people can grow up and be able to be not just monogamous or polyamorous, ambiamorous, but also solo amorous, where they don't necessarily have to be partnered with anyone, and that we respect all these different ways and diversities that human beings can be. And we hope that with our work is that we're able to empower people to have these conversations, and to, instead of just trying to create polyamorous relationships, question where did monogamy come from? Who taught us these ways that are the norms? And getting back a little bit more to our roots.
Beautiful. Actually, while we're here, Nick, what about you? Anything to add?
Everything Millie said. It was good. It was perfect. I'll just add one little thing. I think we live in a world again where monogamy is just the expectation. I dream of a world where all forms of relationship orientations are valued and are seen in many forms, like that diversity of different types of relationships, and it's normalized. And it's just not seen as something deviant. It's not seen as something out of the ordinary, different, where people just, it's just like, oh, you're non-monogamous. Okay, cool. And that's it. And there's no expectation of one or the other as the default. That would be my just one little add to what Millie said.
Yeah, nice to know we have choices, right? Glenn, how about you?
Okay. Actually, when I think about it, I am pretty close to living in the future that I have imagined for many years. I am old enough to remember when the Supreme Court said that two people of any race can get married. I've been part of the struggle to let two people of the same gender get married, and it's happened all around. It first started in local jurisdictions, happened throughout our nation, and hopefully going through the rest of the world. I'm looking forward to the milestone where we can say any number of people that want to declare themselves in a marriage can do so. I see it happening. I think I live in a kinder, gentler world. I know there's a lot still to be done, but I live in a kinder, gentler world than I grew up in as a child, in terms of relationships and people being good to each other, and people knowing that other person is just like me, even if they talk differently, even if they look differently, they are me. So I'm pretty optimistic. I'm looking forward to the future. I have been friends with Oberon Zell for many years, and one of the things that he started off saying, and still says to this day, is when people ask him how to act, he says, just be excellent to each other. And I try to embody that.
I love that. Yes, let's be excellent to each other. Evita, closing thoughts from you?
So when people ask me about, being polyamorous and being a parent, I tell them that I'm not trying to raise non-monogamous children. I'm trying to raise children that know that they have choices. So we cannot have truly consensual relationships if we don't know that we have choices and that we have options. And so the future for me is a future where humans are allowed to have genuinely consensual relationships with others because they have options and they have choices, and that we are not prescribing one size fits all for all humans. And we are able to say, oh, you want to do this like I do? Great. That's fantastic. Oh, you don't want to do this. You want to do this differently. Cool. I love that. I hope you find somebody that said, I'm not that person, but I'm not going to demonize or I'm not going to judge that choice. So I would like to see a future where that exists. I would like to see a future where we view difference as something to get curious about and not as something to judge. And that comes in a variety of ways. I'd also like to really see a future, and this is coming through very strongly for me, is where people are allowed to be in relationships that are genuinely fulfilling for them, because there's so much human isolation, there's so much human disconnection. And I think a lot of that is because, we do not really allow people to feel okay about, naming what is genuinely fulfilling for them. And finding things that are genuinely fulfilling for them. And so I would really like to see the state of the world to where we have more healed, consensual, fulfilling human relationships so we can feel less alone and we can feel less isolated as a species.
Beautiful.
Yeah, beautiful. I see everyone nodding with you. Thank you all so much for this gorgeous conversation. There's so many questions that we received that we're not going to have time to get to tonight, but I do just want to remind you that this is the first event of 40 events happening this week for the Week of Visibility. So if you have questions that didn't get answered, definitely join us. There's so many cool things happening this week. And I just want to thank everybody for donating in support of Open. If you learned something new tonight, if you joined for free and you feel like this was valuable and you have some extra bucks that you want to support, Open's advocacy work, consider making a tax-deductible online contribution. My tech support has dropped the link in the chat right now. Check out the full global event directory at weekofvisibility.com to see there's some really cool in-person events happening. There's lots more online events happening. I want to just highlight a couple. This is happening tomorrow night with 4 more great speakers. So definitely check that out. I have invited my own polycule to participate in a conversation tomorrow evening as well. So if you have more questions about how on earth this type of relationship structure works, we're going to be talking about all of the hard things and all of the beautiful things. And I heard a couple of people talk about boundaries. I'm also going to host a workshop on Wednesday night about how to think about boundaries and reinforce them. And I am so grateful for all of you. Thank you for your time and energy. And we hope to see the rest of you at more events this week. Be well. Let's be excellent to each other. Take good care, everyone. Good night.
Right.